As the music slowed and all eyes turned, the preacher's daughter crossed the dance floor. Not to the town's golden boy, but to the scarred farmer everyone whispered about. She took his hand. He didn't flinch, but the room did. What happened next silenced the whole town. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The orchard hadn't changed, not really. The same ancient trees stood in their crooked rows, some bent like old men, others still proud with spring growth curling toward the sky. But the hands that tended them now worked differently, slower, more careful, as if the man behind them feared damaging something that had already survived too much. Samuel Whitlow lived by those trees. He knew which ones bore early, which needed pruning after the frost, and which, like him, bore scars, but still produced sweetness when it mattered. His days were measured in rows walked, bark touched, fruit inspected. He didn't speak unless he had to, and never about the fire. The barn had gone up quick. Dry summer, old wood, a careless spark from a lantern his father swore had been out. Samuel had dragged his mother out, blistering his palms on iron and splinter, then turned back for the dog that never made it. His father had collapsed under the rafters. Samuel got out. Barely. With his left side charred like meat, his voice reduced to a low rasp that caught on certain words like they were thorns in his throat. He stopped going into town except for salt and flour. Children stared. Some wept. One ran crying to his mother, screaming about the monster in the hat. So Samuel stayed on the land, where the trees didn't care what he looked like. It was a Sunday when he saw her. Not just saw, noticed. The way a man notices the color of dawn the first time he survives a long winter. Hope Ellery, standing in front of the chapel, smoothing her gloves with slow, deliberate fingers. She wasn't beautiful in the way town girls were. No ribbons or perfume. But something about the steadiness in her movements, the quiet strength in her posture, made her glow. When she caught his eye, she didn't flinch. She offered a smile, not the kind people give out of pity or politeness, but one that said, "I see you." Not the mask, not the rumor. You. Samuel didn't smile back, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how anymore. He slipped out before the last hymn, walking quickly past the row of wagons, but her eyes followed him. He felt it like sunlight on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. It began with a pie, warm, spiced with cinnamon and shy defiance. Hope Ellery didn't leave notes, didn't ring the bell, didn't ask to be seen. She only came as far as the gate, the same way others might leave flowers at a grave. Her steps were quiet, deliberate. A hand-woven basket, always with a cloth cover, always arranged with care. A pie here, a jar of plum jam there. Once, a book of poems about rivers and silence. Another time, a blue handkerchief, soft to the touch. Samuel's initials stitched in thread the color of cornflowers. The gifts went untouched at first. Samuel would glance at them from the upper porch, his breath catching, not from suspicion, but from disbelief. Then, quietly, without ceremony, he began leaving things in return. A stack of chopped hickory beside the chapel steps, a tin of honey wrapped in brown paper, apples sorted by ripeness and sheen, as precise as prayer beads. The town, always vigilant where its norms were disturbed, took notice. "She's throwing herself away," murmured Mrs. Bledsoe, squinting over her embroidery hoop as if sewing righteousness into fabric. "Man like that ought to be left in peace, or at least in shadow." Her sister, less charitable, spat the words outright. "She's after his land. Why else bother with a half-man?" But the cruelest whispers curled from Calvin Reddick's lips like pipe smoke. He had offered Hope his arm the previous summer at the Founders' Day fair. She'd smiled politely and turned him down with more grace than he'd ever deserved. Now, watching her walk past him on Market Street with a basket swaying on her arm and no glance his way, he felt not rejection, but insult. And so he laughed where others whispered. "What she think's gonna happen?" He scoffed loudly in the general store, loud enough for the clerks to hear, loud enough to make it sting. "Gonna build a future with a man who looks like a burned-out scarecrow?" Hope didn't respond with words. She brought a basket of Samuel's apples to the Sunday luncheon, slicing them into neat eighths. The air smelled of roast chicken and hymnals. When someone asked where the fruit had come from, she raised one with quiet reverence. "These are from Samuel Whitlow's orchard," she said. "Best apples I've tasted. Grown by a man whose hands carry more grace than anyone I've ever met." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't defiant. But it landed like thunder in a quiet room. A fork slipped from a plate. The chatter died mid-sentence. Even the pastor paused in his chewing. Samuel, just outside the door, half hidden by the wood-paneled entryway, heard every word. He didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. But something old and bitter inside him, something that had curled up and gone still, stirred. Not out of hope, out of recognition. The orchard had never heard such laughter. It came in pieces at first. A soft breath when Hope misstepped over a root, a quick chuckle when Samuel muttered that the tree was temperamental. But it grew, little by little, like the first green shoots after a long winter. Each evening they walked the rows between trees, the light slanting gold through thinning leaves, their boots stirring fallen petals and broken twigs. No need for speeches. The rhythm of their steps, the quiet of the land, the slow exchange of small knowledge. It was a courtship without pretense. Samuel showed her where the soil held too much clay and where wild mint grew between fence posts. He spoke in low tones, raspy but certain, guiding her fingers as she tied grafting twine or thinned fruit with a knife older than both of them. He'd thought himself ruined, too grotesque for anything gentle. But beside her, he found a kind of grace again, not from forgetting what had happened, but from being allowed to live with it. Hope, for her part, never asked him to hide. When she read aloud from the little book of Psalms she carried in her apron pocket, she didn't soften her voice or glance nervously at his scars. Her presence, like the orchard in bloom, did not flinch from broken branches. It made space for them. One afternoon, kneeling beside a sapling that had split in the frost, she looked up at him with a faint smile. "You know," she said, brushing dirt from her skirt, "these trees aren't beautiful because they're untouched. They're beautiful because they survived." He couldn't speak right away. The next morning, he began working on the swing. It wasn't an act of romance, not in the way townsfolk would tell it. It was something older, quieter. He picked the tallest tree on the ridge, one with roots as thick as barrels and bark like 100 years of storms. The swing he built by hand, sanding each board until the edges were smooth and warm to the touch. He tied the ropes with double knots and tested them himself, gripping them until his knuckles went white. When he invited her to try it, he didn't watch her face. He watched her feet leave the earth, watched the hem of her skirt catch the wind, watched the way the light caught the curve of her neck as she tilted her head back and laughed, truly laughed, as if the whole orchard were hers. And in that moment, Samuel didn't feel ashamed. He felt part of the world again. Not hidden, not pitied, simply present. The barn had been swept clean for the harvest dance, but the scent of hay still lingered in the beams. Old, warm, familiar. Lanterns swung gently from the rafters, their light catching on crepe streamers and polished boots. The townspeople gathered early, smiling behind pies and jars of cider, their voices loud with the kind of excitement that comes once a year and leaves stories behind. Samuel Whitlow arrived late, not out of fear, not anymore, but because it took time to gather the courage to be seen as he was, not as others remembered him. His shirt was clean, collar stiff, boots freshly brushed, but no hat shadowed his face tonight. The scars were bare under the lantern light, etched deep into flesh like fire-carved stone. He didn't flinch. He'd earned them. He had learned to wear them like armor. Hope saw him before anyone else did. She stood near the corner where the fiddle warmed up, her pale blue dress soft as dawn. Her hair was pulled back simply, no feathers or flowers, only a ribbon the color of cream. When she crossed the barn floor toward him, time seemed to falter, like even the dust in the beams held its breath. He offered his hand, rough and calloused. She took it without hesitation. When they stepped into the circle of music, a hush rolled through the crowd like the shifting of wind before a storm. Murmurs, not loud, but sharp-edged, hushed too late. A child asked her mother, "Is that the man from the orchard?" and was pulled gently behind her skirt. The fiddler began slow, the notes long and low like a prayer over empty fields. Samuel moved stiff at first, uncertain, but Hope's hand at his shoulder steadied him. They found rhythm, then quiet grace. He didn't lead with flair or show, but with care. He watched her feet, not out of nervousness, but reverence, as if each step was a hymn he'd never dared sing. And she looked only at him. No whispers could reach her where she stood. By the final note, they weren't just dancing, they were declaring. When the preacher stood, silence followed. His words came without weighty ceremony, but with the ache of a father laying down pride for truth. I now see the answer is a man who never asked, because he never thought he was. The air broke then, not with applause, but with breath, the kind people didn't realize they'd been holding. Samuel's jaw clenched. His hand trembled in hopes, but he didn't step back. He stepped forward, and when she whispered, "Come home with me," it wasn't a request. It was a promise that love, true love, never once flinched at the face the world feared. That night, beneath stars strung like lanterns over the orchard, something inside Samuel finally healed, not erased, but healed.